Okay, so last time we were talking about Nogales, north and south of the fence, Carlos Slim, Bill Gates. I want to start the second module with another example in the same spirit, and then I want to introduce the key terminology in the book. There's something distinct about the institutions in the United States and Mexico, and I was motivating that by the different ways they incentivized Bill Gates and Carlos Slim to kind of put their energy in different ways. There's different ways to make money. They have very different consequences for the societies, for the general prosperity of the society. Another great example we use in the book is Korea. If you look at the Korean peninsula at night, you see south of the 38th parallel that separates North and South Korea, south of there, the Korean peninsula is ablaze with light. It's incredibly bright. North of the 38th parallel, it's black. So that represents huge differences in living standards. Of course, technology as well, electricity, light bulbs, not very recent technology, but very important technology for influencing people's living standards, for productivity, for everything else. Okay, so in fact, South Korea, North Korea, again, like Nogales, they share common history, geography, common culture, whatever is causing those huge differences between North and South Korea. North Korea has the living standards of a sub-Saharan African country. South Korea is a member of the OECD. It has living standards similar to Southern Europe. It's a massive development success. Whatever generates that difference, it's not culture, it's not geography, it's not history. It's something much more recent than that. In fact, that difference didn't exist in 1950. It was created when Korea got split into half at the 38th parallel, and very different institutions got created in the south of Korea than in the north of Korea. And in fact, those institutions, those different institutions, have a lot in common with the institutions north and south of the fence in Nogales. And the terminology we use for talking about that are inclusive and extractive. What the United States has is inclusive economic institutions. That's what Bill Gates responded to. What Mexico has are extractive economic institutions. That's what Carlos Slim responded to. So what do we mean by inclusive and extractive? By inclusive, we mean sets of rules that create broad-based incentives and opportunities in society. And extractive institutions, extractive economic institutions, are those which block incentives and opportunities and concentrate them in the hands of a few people like Carlos Slim. Let me dwell on this word inclusion because it's very, very important for understanding prosperity. And I'm going to do that with the light bulb. Who invented that? I talked about the light bulbs in South Korea. Who invented the light bulb? Thomas Edison, one of the world's most famous innovators in the 19th century. He patented it in 1880. What's a patent? Okay, well, if you come up with an idea like Edison did or like Bill Gates did, there's a problem with ideas. You come up with the idea, you create it, you work hard, you invest, you think, you come up with the idea. But other people could immediately borrow that idea and use it without putting all that effort into it. Okay, so that's called in economics a non-rivalrous good. A rivalrous good is if I have a cup of coffee and I drink it, you can't drink it too. Only I can drink it. But an idea, I can use the idea, you can use the idea. So that means a key problem in innovation is that when I come up with an idea, other people can take it from me, and that undermines my incentives to innovate. So the idea of a patent is a patent protects your intellectual property rights. Edison took out a patent on his light bulb. That stopped other people copying, so he could make more money, more income from his innovation, and that created incentives to innovate. Okay, so a patent is a key thing that sort of aligns people's private incentives with what's in the national welfare. Now, a patent is a very interesting institution. The US Constitution actually included a clause which allowed for patents, and the first patent board, which sat in 1790, was so important that Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson sat on the patent board deciding whose ideas merited getting a patent to protect their intellectual property rights. What's interesting about intellectual property rights innovation is as follows. Who was Thomas Edison? Was he an elite person? Was he rich? Was he wealthy? No, he was homeschooled. His father was a roofing contractor. Edison was just a brilliant, innovative, creative person. And if you look at the social background of innovators, of people who came up with ideas like the light bulb, you'll see that they're everywhere in society. Okay? Innovation, ideas, creativity, that's scattered all over. People are different. People are people. So if you want to have a society which is innovative, which is prosperous, which creates new technologies, new ideas, I'm coming to the Industrial Revolution, you need to tap into all that latent talent in society. You don't know where it is, so you need to create a level playing field so that talent can come to the top. And that's what the patent system did. The patent system applied to everybody. Everybody's paid the same fee. If you had an invention, you could come forward, you could file, you could pay the same fee, you could get a patent, and the state would enforce the patent. Okay, I'm coming back to that. So it would enforce, it would protect your intellectual property rights. That's what it did for Edison. Okay, so that's where this word inclusion comes from. Okay, if you want to have a prosperous society, you have to have inclusive institutions. You have to have a level playing field so that everybody's included. So you can harness all that latent talent in society. And that's what inclusive economic institutions do. I think the patent system is a great example of that. Extractive institutions are completely different. They block most people's incentives and opportunities. Think of monopoly. Only Carlos Slim can provide telecom services in Mexico. Everybody else is out. Okay? Think of the computer industry. Bill Gates. Lots of competition. Everybody trying to enter, to get into the action. Of course, Gates wanted to stop them, but he was brought in front of the antitrust authorities and found guilty of violating the Sherman Act. Microsoft was punished for trying to exert monopolistic practices. There's a beautiful photograph of Bill Gates appearing in Washington, D.C., promising to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That scene is unimaginable in Mexico. Okay. So, inclusive economic institutions create board-based incentives, opportunities, stimulate investment, innovation. Extractive institutions, economic institutions block that. Okay, so that's the very first important level of the book. The difference between the United States and Mexico, between rich countries and poor countries, is that rich countries have inclusive economic institutions and poor countries have extractive economic institutions. But you can't stop there. You have to ask, okay, fine, but where do those come from? Is it just that the United States has better economists than Mexico or the Democratic Republic of Congo? That may be true, but that's not the real reason. The real reason is to do with politics. Economic institutions are chosen by society through a political process. So lying behind inclusive and extractive economic institutions are political institutions that create those different economic institutions. And we use the same language to describe those. We say, the difference between the United States and the difference between Mexico is the United States had inclusive political institutions, and it was those inclusive political institutions that created the inclusive economic institutions. In Mexico, they had extractive political institutions. So let me elaborate a little bit on what I mean by inclusive and extractive political institutions. And I'm going to do that with the patent law. So where did the patent law come from? Why is it in the United States they had a law which created the same opportunities for everybody? That's fundamentally to do with the distribution of political power in the United States. The patent law took the form it did because political power was very broadly distributed. Of course, at the time of the Constitution, the United States wasn't a democracy in the modern sense. Women couldn't vote. Of course, slaves couldn't vote. Adult white men, more or less, were enfranchised. But by world historical standards, that was a very democratic society, and political power was sufficiently broadly spread that you couldn't have a patent law that favored some people over other people. You had to have a level playing field. So the first element of inclusive political institutions is the distribution of political power has to be broad. Okay, we call it pluralistic in Why Nations Fail. It's a bit of a political science jargon, so let me not get hung up on that word. I think the broad distribution of political power is important. That's what generated such an inclusive patent law. But the second part of inclusive political institutions already came up as well. You've got to be able to enforce the patent law. Okay? The state had the capacity to enforce the law. The state had the capacity to enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act against Bill Gates, the richest man in the world. Okay? That's unimaginable in Mexico. So inclusive political institutions have those two aspects, both the distribution of power and the capacity of the state. And extractive political institutions, and this is going to be important in the next module, extractive, we say political institutions are extractive if either of those things fail, either if the state doesn't have capacity or political power is narrowly concentrated. But so, coming back to the motivation I started with, why are some countries rich and other countries poor? Now we sort of know the answer the book suggests. Some countries are rich because they have inclusive economic institutions that create broad-based patterns of incentives and opportunities that create investment and innovation. They have such economic institutions because they have inclusive political institutions. Poor countries have extractive economic institutions, and they have those economic institutions because they have extractive political institutions. It's politics that creates extractive and inclusive economies, and ultimately it's politics that creates prosperity or poverty.